The marshes was never dried completely. It is impossible. What was dried really was the already shallow areas of the marshes. The deep areas of the marshes were not dry. It's impossible to dry. The first 5 years of sanctions, I was Director General of the State Company of Oil Projects, which is a project implementation and construction company. We were pivotal in the effort of reconstruction after the bombing of 1991 war. And we did not only participate in reconstructing damaged installations in the oil industry, but we participated also in other sectors such as irrigation, housing, telecommunications, railways, roads, bridges, and so on. In 1995, I became Director General of the Planning Ministry of the Ministry of Oil, and eventually I was the coordinator of the Ministry of Oil negotiation with the United Nations to provide materials and equipment to keep the industry going. When the war happened in 2003, I was Director General of the Technical Directorate in the Ministry of Oil, which is responsible for the day-to-day operations, both in the upstream sector and the downstream sector, which is the crude oil sector and the oil product sector. And in 2003, I stayed in my function and doing my duties up to the fall of Baghdad on the 9th of April 2003. I continued being the technical director of the Ministry of Oil after the occupation, took a long leave in November 2003, and eventually retired in March 2004 upon my own personal request. And now I'm retired and living in Jordan. The Marshes project really is an old story. It's long before the 2003 war. It's long before the 1991 Gulf War. It started in the middle 70s when major oil fields like the north of North Rumaila and the West Gorna were discovered, and the Majnoon oil field was discovered in the Hawaiza marshes, which is adjacent to the Iranian border. At that time, the technology of oil drilling was not as advanced as it is now, where you can do horizontal drilling, distant drilling, and so on. You had to drill vertically in the same position. So a drying process of the marshes started in the middle 70s to provide dry land for the drilling rigs and the oil installations. This happened in the west, what we call the West Marshes, which is the Hammar, west of the Tigris, and north of the Euphrates and the south of the Euphrates, and also in the Hawaiza marshes. And dry islands were made for the drilling rigs to start drilling. Actually, when the 1980 war between Iraq and Iran happened, some of the fiercest battles between Iraq and Iran happened on the Majnoon Islands, which are artificial islands made up out of drying of the marshes. The field of what we call North Rumaila and West Gorna, something like 400 oil wells were drilled on dry land, again obtained from drying of the marshes. And actually there was a very long swath of land running west of the Tigris north of the Euphrates, south of the Euphrates, and all of it was for the drilling of oil wells. So the drying of the marshes was an oil necessity in a way, and also it was coordinated with the irrigation ministry, because there was an older project in the 50s of drying some part of the marshes and turning them into fertile agricultural lands. When the war between Iraq and Iran happened, some drying also was made, because what we call defensive dikes were built so that the forces will take defenses. So the drying of the marshes was really an old story. It's the 1970s and 1980s, but nobody spoke about them. After the sanctions, the insurgents which come from Iran started being more active inside the marshes. And also the economic necessity inside the country of finding public projects to absorb unemployment and to let their economy drive, the government embarked on major projects. One of them was to complete the project of drying some parts of the marshes. And people, lots of lands. At that time, I was Director General of the State Company of Oil Projects, and we participated in the building of some dikes. But the whole project was coordinated by the Ministry of Irrigation. It was an irrigation a project. It was not a military project. And by the 2003 war, people have been settled on the dry lands. Dry lands were allocated, villages were built, electricity was connected, fresh water was taken to these villages.
So you are an eyewitness on that?
I have seen some of these villages prosper in that area. There was, during the period of sanctions, suddenly erupted international propaganda about the drying of the marshes. We didn't know why. I mean, in 1970s and 80s, as I said, there was a drying of the marshes. Why did it erupt in the 90s? Obviously for political reasons. Even Prince Charles of the UK spoke for the marshes, Arabs, and for 1,000 years of civilization, and so on. 2003, when I was in the ministry, we saw things which really reflects the incompetence and misunderstanding of the whole occupation strategy in Iraq. We saw people, probably out of goodwill, coming into Iraq saying, let us flood the marshes. Well, obviously, what they have taken sides, without knowing probably, that they are biased towards the fishermen and the bird hunters who wants the marshes to be enlarged, and went against the people who have settled and became farmers in the new villages after the marshes were dried. And the dikes were broken in some vital parts, and a large area was reflooded again without a proper without a proper study, without a proper background study of saying what will reflooding of the marshes, how will it affect the people. Things have changed. People like Dr. Azzam Alwash comes into my office. Apparently he was the coordinator of the Marshes projects after the occupation. And the man was talking about the Auda marshes, which is west of the Tigris. And he was saying how marvelous it was and how quiet it was that the reflooded marshes looked like. Environmentally, it's nice. He was in a mash'oof inside the marsh, and you could not hear a sound. I asked him what happened to the villages who were already there before the marshes were flooded. He just was not aware. And he was talking about, he came to the Ministry of Oil for that purpose, about getting gas, natural gas, on a network linking all these, one house there, two houses there in the marshes, to link them all together. What for? To install RO units for fresh water. So I asked, who will look after the RO technology? Who will look after the generators? 4,000 years ago, people in the marshes did not have RO units or generators. So obviously the whole thing is run by dreamers and with total disregard of the people who have settled, total disregard of what went on before them and what was the purpose. What annoys me is the generalized classification of the Iraqis' effort before the 2003 war, all of it as a Saddam intention, it is a criminal, it's against the people. Now that is a very unfair classification. And probably the drying of the marshes, it may have security or defense connotation or anti-insurgency purposes. But at the same time, it is economically maybe, and indeed, in my opinion, it is a viable project. It is for the service of the inhabitants of these people. And now what is happening? It's a muddle. You see, you reflooded parts of the marshes and you've got people now, thousands, are complaining because you destroyed their farmlands. You re-established small islands here and there, one with 2 houses, the other with the 3 houses, the other 4, and all demanding electricity, water, and schooling. How are you going to do that over such a scattered area? It's really, people came there not for to do something which is beneficial to the people of the marshes. No, their aim was to reflood the marshes, period. The marshes function basically is like lungs for the two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. When the floodwater comes in the spring all the way from Turkey, then there is, before it goes into the Gulf, it just refloods that area. Now, the water that comes from Turkey is hardly enough to reach Baghdad. You look at the Tigris River and it is very shallow. During the period of April, when we used to be in my childhood, everybody was under warning that we could flood any time. And the Euphrates, it does not even, is not good enough for irrigation because the water is so shallow. So there is not enough water to get to the marshes anyway, because Turkey has built, on their side, have built dams, have built storage lakes, and also Iraq, to protect Baghdad from flooding, they have built many, many dikes and many storage location before Baghdad. So by the time the water gets to the marshes nowadays, is not enough water to reflood the whole area as it used to be done before. It just very restricted. So the romance of the water buffaloes and of that, it's really, you see, when you take a snapshot of the marshes at dusk, and when you see the water buffaloes come back home, and the photo is against the sun coming down, it looks lovely in pictures. But when you're there, and when you see the people, the diseases, the dirt, the deprivation, the poverty, then you realize you have to do something for these people. So if you are concerned about the people, really, you should re-look again at your opinion of what is the purpose of the flooding of or drying of the marshes. Well, all what was achieved was some people encouraged to go and break the dikes and reflooding of parts of the marshes. And all the rest is just some good intentioned organization, especially the Italians, funded the projects of resettlement and establishment of services to these people. But they are, I mean, the last time I saw Azam Alwash on film, he was talking about his dream of seeing a laptop in every hut in the marshes talking with an internet with people in the United States. Now, obviously, he's not trying to re-establish a 4,000 years old civilization. He's only trying to justify the financing he is getting, and all what they are achieving probably is nothing. Like the whole project of reconstruction in Iraq, which was led by the United States. Billions were spent, but the results are in the wind. You know, it's nothing.
هجرك عليا ترف هنظل قيسة وامور ترى ما تجرع الروح كيف امر عليها وامر الاحصان اجر رؤيتك واوصل لدارك وامور اصيح يا منيتي صوت الصدى ينباين المادر بعلتي المادر بعلتي قال الرجل
The marshes was never dried completely. It is impossible. The western marshes were, which is northwest of Basra, where the project was implemented. The Hawaiza marshes was left as its own, with only the two Majnoon islands in it. Nobody touched it. Just a dike was built around it to protect the city of Hammar from flooding. The northwestern marshes, the Hammar and the Gorna marshes, they were, part of them were dried and finished in 1994, 1995. And one huge river called El-Ez River was made to channel the water, and it runs parallel to the Tigris to the west, and it comes from Qal'at Saleh to Gorna. And that river was a roaring river, you know, and it was utilized for irrigation of the new dry lands. What was dried really was the already shallow areas of the marshes. The deep areas of the marshes were not dry. It's impossible to dry. Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that two things. One, what the Iraqis did before 2003 should not be always classified as a criminal or security or militarily. There were a lot of good things which people worked very hard to achieve. And Iraq was a prosperous, self-reliant country by the effort of its people. And that should not be underestimated. The second is that when you criminalize something, you should, some people criminalize a project, anybody should listen to the facts and the truth, and should listen to the other side of the story, and not just criminalizing because it is the cloud of propaganda has been put around it. The dying of the marshes in Iraq is a typical example of what kind the propaganda leads you to.
ترى حذر الضلع ما علام، حذر الضلع ما علام، شكل سهم جنبي اطلع سلس كبدتي.